Nothing inside St. Michael's Cathedral prepared anyone for what happened during the final blessing. The priest had just raised his hands over the rings. 300 guests, senators, shipping magnates, men who never sat with their backs to a door went quiet out of habit, not reverence. Then the rear doors opened. 5 boys walked in first, holding hands in pairs, the smallest between them, all dressed in matching black tuxedos with bow ties pulled slightly crooked, like someone had dressed them in a hurry. Behind them came a woman in an emerald green gown, spine straight, jaw set, not looking at anyone but the altar. She didn't rush. She didn't have to. At the front pew, without a word passing between them, all 5 boys reached up and straightened their own collars at the exact same moment. Then all 5 tilted their heads a half-inch to the left. Then all 5 went still, watching the groom the way a mirror watches a room. Seo Jinhwan's hand, still holding his bride's, went cold. He knew that collar-straightening motion. He'd done it since he was 9 years old, the night his father taught him to tie a bow tie in a hospital corridor and told him a man always checks his collar before he says something he can't take back. No one had ever caught him doing it. He didn't know he still did it. The smallest boy let go of his brother's hand, walked halfway up the aisle, and looked directly at Jinhwan. Mommy said if the man at the front does that with his collar, he's really our father. You just did it. The cathedral did not gasp. It went silent in the worst way, the way a room goes silent right before something breaks permanently. Jinhwan's bride turned to him, one hand rising slowly to her mouth. Because 6 years earlier, a woman named Daniela had left Seoul without a note, a call, or a reason, at the exact moment Jinhwan's mentor had assured him she'd simply moved on. He had believed it. He had built an empire on top of that belief. He was about to learn every piece of it was a lie. Seo Jinhwan was never supposed to feel anything at his own wedding. That was the point of it. This marriage wasn't a union of 2 hearts. It was a merger of 2 syndicates, negotiated over 18 months by men who'd never once asked whether he wanted it. He'd agreed because wanting things was a weakness he'd trained out of himself years ago, ever since the woman who taught him how to want something had vanished without a trace. Now she was standing in the back of a cathedral in an emerald green gown, and 5 boys with his exact posture, his exact stillness, his exact way of watching a room before entering it, were staring straight through him. Whatever Daniela had come to say, it was clear from her face she hadn't come to stop a wedding. She'd come because she was out of places to hide 5 identical reasons someone might want them both dead. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and find out just how far our story has traveled. Candle. Seo Jinhwan had learned to walk into any room like he already owned it, because in the circles he moved through, hesitation was the first thing predators noticed. By 29, he ran the shipping and logistics arm of the Seo syndicate in all but name, the empire his grandfather had built out of Buson's docks, and his father had nearly lost to a rival family before dying in a car that had been tampered with. Jinhwan had been 16 when that happened. He remembered exactly what it felt like to watch grief get folded into strategy within 48 hours, his uncles already dividing territory over his father's casket. He'd promised himself then that he would never again be the softest person in a room. He kept that promise so well that by the time he stood at the altar of St. Michael's Cathedral, marrying a woman he respected, but had never once imagined a future with, none of the 300 guests watching him could have told you whether he felt anything at all. The marriage had been arranged the way most important things in his world were arranged, quietly, over months, by men in tailored suits who called it an alliance and meant a truce. His bride's family controlled the ports along the western coast. His controlled everything that moved through them. Uniting the two would end a decade of quiet skirmishes and give both families more power than either could hold alone. His mentor, Chairman Han, the man who had stepped into the role of father after Jinhwan's own was murdered, the man who had taught him patience, restraint, the difference between a threat and a promise, had called the match the smartest decision this family will make in 20 years. Jin Hwan had trusted that judgment the way he trusted very little else in his life. Han had never once given him a reason not to. So when the rear doors of the cathedral opened during the final blessing, Jin Hwan's first instinct wasn't fear. It was irritation, the reflexive alertness of a man whose life had trained him to read interruptions as threats before he even turned his head. Then he saw the boys. He would spend the rest of his life trying to describe that moment to people who hadn't been there and never quite managing it. It wasn't just that the 5 boys resembled him. Children resemble adults all the time, in ways that mean nothing. It was that they moved like him. The collar straightening, the half-inch tilt of the head. The stillness, the particular way all 5 of them seemed to be watching the room rather than being watched by it. Exactly the habit his father had beaten into him as a survival instinct before he was old enough to understand why. He'd never taught anyone that. He didn't know he still did it. Then the smallest boy spoke the sentence that ended his wedding, and Jin Hwan felt something in his chest give way that he hadn't touched in 6 years. Daniela did not run to him. She didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't do any of the things the guests probably expected from a woman crashing another man's wedding. She simply walked her sons partway up the aisle, stopped at a respectful distance, and looked at him with an expression he recognized instantly, because he'd spent 6 years trying to forget it. The specific, controlled calm of someone who has rehearsed this moment so many times in her head that living it feels almost unreal. "I didn't come for the wedding," she said, and her voice, accented faintly with the Swahili coast and the years of English boarding school before it, was steady in a way that made the silence in the cathedral feel enormous. "I came because someone is trying to kill your sons, and I have run out of countries to hide them in." The bride's family's security men had their hands inside their jackets before the priest finished processing the sentence. Jin Hwan raised one hand without looking at them, an old habit from a life where a single gesture could mean the difference between a diplomatic incident and a funeral, and the room, remarkably, obeyed him. He had met Daniela Achieng 7 years earlier, in Mombasa, at a shipping conference. His father had sent him to attend in his place because Jin Hwan spoke passable English and needed, in his father's words, to learn that the ocean doesn't care what your last name is. She had been 24, running logistics for a Kenyan export consortium, sharp enough to catch 3 of his company's men trying to undercut a contract before Jin Hwan himself noticed, and unimpressed enough by his family name that she'd corrected his Korean-accented pronunciation of a Swahili phrase in front of 40 people, and then bought him a beer to apologize for embarrassing him. He had fallen for her so completely and so fast that it frightened him, a man who had spent a decade building walls specifically so nothing could fall on him the way his father's death had. For 8 months, they'd carried on something neither of them called a relationship out loud, because his world had no place in it for a woman who wasn't Korean, wasn't connected, wasn't useful to an alliance. He flew to Nairobi under false names. She met him in Busan twice, disguised as a business contact, and both times they'd stood on the same stretch of harbor at night, the one place in the city that felt like it belonged to neither of their families. And he had told her things he'd never told anyone, about his father, about Han, about the specific loneliness of being groomed to inherit an empire nobody had asked if he wanted. Then, without warning, she stopped answering his calls. Her number disconnected. Her apartment in Nairobi was suddenly occupied by someone else who'd never heard of her. He'd spent 4 months and a small fortune trying to find her before Chairman Han, gently, the way you tell someone a hard truth for their own good, suggested that perhaps she had simply moved on. That some people weren't built for the kind of life Jin Hwan could offer, and that a man in his position needed to stop chasing ghosts and start thinking about the future of the family. Jin Hwan had believed him. He had grieved her the way you grieve someone who chose to leave, with anger folded over the hurt like a bandage, and he had built the rest of his life on top of that grief without ever once questioning the foundation. Now, standing in the vestry with his ruined wedding dissolving into scandal behind him, Daniela told him the truth in 11 sentences that took less than a minute to say and would take him the rest of his life to fully absorb. She had been 3 months pregnant when she disappeared. Not with 1 child, with 5, an outcome so statistically rare her Nairobi doctor had needed a specialist to confirm it. Natural quintuplets conceived in what she still, even now, called the best 8 months of her life. She had been preparing to tell him the week 2 men from his own organization arrived at her apartment, polite and terrifyingly thorough, and explained that a pregnancy like hers would make her and any children a permanent point of leverage against the CO family for the rest of their lives. Used by rivals, used by kidnappers, used by anyone who ever wanted something from Jin Hwan and needed a lever to get it. They hadn't threatened her. They'd simply shown her, calmly, everything they already knew about her mother's address in Kisumu, her sister's clinic, the school her nephew attended, and let her draw her own conclusions about what protecting her children would require. She had disappeared herself, on her own terms, before they could disappear her on theirs. For 6 years, she had raised 5 identical boys, Kido, Baraka, Juma, Amani, and the youngest, Zuri, who had spoken the sentence in the cathedral, across 3 countries and 11 different names, teaching them to never repeat their real birthday to anyone outside the house, to memorize false stories about their father, to run drills for what to do if strangers followed them home from school. She had done it alone, without money from a family that didn't know she existed, working logistics jobs under aliases, moving whenever a landlord asked one question too many. She had told herself for 6 years that Jin Hwan had let her go easily, that whatever he'd felt for her hadn't survived contact with real inconvenience. And she had believed that story right up until 3 weeks ago, when a man she didn't recognize had approached Zuri outside his school in Accra and asked, very casually, whether his mother had ever mentioned a man named Sio. It wasn't ransom they wanted, she was almost certain. It was something worse, though she didn't yet have proof of what. Someone had known about the boys for 6 years and done nothing, until now, until the wedding that would consolidate Jin Hwan's power beyond any single family's ability to challenge it. She had run out of places to hide and concluded, with the same clear-eyed logic that had kept 5 boys alive for 6 years, that the only place left safe enough to protect them was directly in front of the man everyone was afraid of. Jin Hwan didn't sleep that night. He sat in a private room of his own house with 5 boys he had known for 6 hours, watching them eat rice with the specific, careful table manners of children who had been taught that drawing attention to yourself could be dangerous. And he felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed since he was 16 years old. He spent the following week doing something he had never done in his adult life. Nothing official, nothing strategic, simply sitting with each of his sons individually, letting them decide how close to let him get. Kido, the eldest by 4 minutes, tested him constantly, watching for the lie he was certain adults always eventually told. Baraka drew elaborate maps of imaginary cities and narrated wars between them with a seriousness that made Jin Hwan quietly proud and quietly terrified. Juma barely spoke the first 3 days, and then, on the 4th, without any lead-up, asked Jin Hwan to check under his bed for anyone hiding there, a habit Jin Hwan recognized instantly, because his own father had done the same nightly check for him after the first attempt on their family's life, 23 years earlier. The moment that undid him completely came on the 5th day. Amani, working on a puzzle, hit a difficult piece, and without thinking, tapped it twice against the table before setting it aside to come back to later. The exact gesture, down to the rhythm, that Jin Hwan's father used to do with problems he wasn't ready to solve yet. A habit Jin Hwan had inherited so unconsciously he'd never once noticed himself doing it, until he watched a 6-year-old do it perfectly. A mannerism from a dead man passed through him into a child who had never met either of them. He excused himself, walked to the harbor, the same stretch of water where he used to meet Daniela in secret, and stood there until the sun came up, finally believing all the way down that these were his sons, and that 6 years of his life had been stolen from him by someone he trusted. That someone, he began to suspect within days, was closer than he wanted to admit. The 2 men who had approached Daniela in Nairobi 6 years earlier had used names that traced back to a security contractor the family had quietly stopped working with around the same time. A contractor whose final invoice had been personally approved. Jin H. Wan discovered after 2 sleepless nights going through archived records he technically wasn't supposed to have unsupervised access to, by Chairman Han himself. He told himself it meant nothing. Han approved hundreds of invoices a year. But he couldn't stop noticing, once he started looking, how many small threads from the last 6 years led back to the same man who had comforted him the loudest about Daniela, moving on. The same man who had pushed hardest for this particular marriage, this particular alliance, at this particular time. He began investigating in the only way he knew how to do anything. Quietly, patiently, trusting no one, not even the men who had served his father for 20 years, because he no longer knew which of them might report his questions back to Han before he was ready. He pulled financial records under false pretenses. He had a cousin in the finance ministry run a discreet check on payments the syndicate had made to a Kenyan security firm no one else remembered hearing. Every thread he pulled tightened rather than loosened, and every night he came home to 5 boys who trusted him a little more than they had the day before. He felt the 2 halves of his life, the empire he'd inherited, and the family he'd just discovered pulling further apart, until he understood, with the specific dread of a man watching a wall crack before it falls, that keeping both intact was no longer possible. Daniela watched all of this from a careful distance, not yet ready to fully forgive a man whose absence had cost her 6 years of her life, but slowly, undeniably, softening toward someone who spent every evening on the floor of a nursery he'd built in 4 days, letting Zuri fall asleep against his shoulder while he answered Keto's suspicious questions with more patience than she'd known he possessed. One night, after the boys were asleep, she found him standing at the harbor again, and instead of walking past him the way she had every night since arriving, she stood beside him. "I used to think," she said quietly, watching the water, "that you let me go because it was easier than fighting for something inconvenient." "I would have burned the whole family down looking for you," Jin H. Wan said, "if anyone had told me there was something to look for." She didn't answer that, but she didn't walk away either, and for the first time in 6 years, that felt like something close to enough. The collapse of the wedding took 11 days to become a war, which in Jin H. Wan's world counted as remarkably slow. His almost bride's family withdrew from the alliance within 48 hours, publicly citing irreconcilable circumstances and privately sending word through 3 intermediaries that they considered the broken engagement a calculated insult rather than an accident of timing. Without the marriage to bind the 2 syndicates together, the fragile decade-long truce between them began fraying at exactly the seams everyone had spent years pretending didn't exist. Within a week, one of his bride's cousins, a man Jin H. Wan had shaken hands with at a dozen functions and never once trusted, moved to seize 2 of the CO family's smaller shipping routes along the western coast, testing to see whether the syndicate without its promised alliance was still strong enough to hold what it already had. It was, but barely. And only because Jin H. Wan fought for it personally, in ways his father would have recognized and Han, strangely, seemed almost disappointed by. Twice in 1 week, trucks carrying CO cargo were intercepted before they reached port, the drivers beaten and left with messages rather than ransom demands. A warning, not a negotiation. Jin H. Wan doubled security on every property connected to Daniela, and the boys before either attack finished making the news, because he had stopped believing, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, that any of this was really about shipping routes at all. Han called it wartime instinct sharpening in him. Jin H. Wan was beginning to suspect it was something closer to guilt, misdirected outward, from a man who already knew where the real threat was standing and hadn't yet let himself believe it. The proof, when it finally arrived, came from the one place Jin H. Wan had been most reluctant to look, the ledgers of his own household staff. A quiet payment, made 6 years earlier through 4 shell accounts before landing in the possession of a security contractor who had since vanished from every record, except the one Jin H. Wan's cousin unearthed in the finance ministry, traced back not to a rival family, not to an outside enemy, but to an account Chairman Han had opened the same month Daniela disappeared, under a name that belonged to his late wife. Jin H. Wan sat with that information for 2 full days before he did anything with it, running through every kindness Han had ever shown him. The hospital corridor lessons, the quiet counsel after his father's murder, 20 years of being the only adult in Jin Hwan's life who had never once asked him for anything, and searching, almost desperately, for an explanation that didn't end where the evidence clearly pointed. He didn't find one. He confronted Han in the old man's study, the same room where Han had once told him, gently, that Daniela had simply moved on, and he laid the documents on the desk between them without a word. Han looked at them for a long moment, and then, instead of denying it, poured himself a drink, which Jin Hwan understood immediately was its own confession. "I did it to protect this family," Han said, finally. "The same family your father built and died for. A pregnancy like that, discovered by the wrong people, would have made you and everyone connected to you a target for the rest of your life. I removed the danger before it could grow teeth." "You removed my sons," Jin Hwan said. "You removed 6 years I will never get back." "I removed a woman with no name in our world and children who didn't officially exist," Han said, and there was no apology in it, only the flat certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own judgment. "I would do it again." That was the sentence that told Jin Hwan the conversation was already over, because a man who would do it again was not a man who could be reasoned with. He was a threat that had simply been wearing a familiar face for 20 years. And Han, watching that understanding cross Jin Hwan's expression, seemed to reach the same conclusion at the same moment, that the boy he had raised into an heir had just stopped being useful to him. The attack came 2 nights later, while Jin Hwan was at a council meeting Han had specifically requested, the timing so deliberate that Jin Hwan understood. The moment his phone lit up with his head of household securities number, exactly what Han had engineered and exactly how long he'd had to plan it. The house had been breached through the service entrance, the 2 junior guards there overpowered before either could raise an alarm loud enough to carry. By the time Jin Hwan's senior detail responded, Daniela was on the floor of the nursery hallway with a wound along her forearm from trying to physically block the door, and all 5 boys were gone. Jin Hwan had commanded violent men doing violent things for a decade, and he had never once felt anything close to what moved through him standing in that hallway, looking at the blood on the floor and the empty beds beyond it. He did not shout. He did not break anything. He went very, very still, in the exact way his sons went still when they were afraid. And then he began making calls in a voice so calm his own security chief would later say, it frightened him more than any order barked in anger ever had. Within 3 hours, half the city's underworld understood that something had shifted. Jin Hwan called in every debt, every favor, every uneasy truce he had ever personally brokered rather than inherited, and made it unmistakably clear, without ever raising his voice, that any organization sheltering Han or his men, knowingly or not, would be treated as having declared war on the Seo family directly. Old rivals who had spent years testing his shipping routes suddenly found themselves fielding calls from Jin Hwan himself, offering information in exchange for neutrality, offering neutrality in exchange for silence about which side they'd chosen. By midnight, 3 separate crime families that had never once cooperated with each other were quietly comparing notes on Han's movements, less out of loyalty to Jin Hwan than out of the universal underworld instinct to be on the winning side of a war before it finished being fought. Daniela, arm bandaged and refusing every suggestion that she rest, sat with Jin Hwan over a spread map of the city's industrial districts and told him, with the same clear-eyed calculation that had kept the boys alive for 6 years, exactly which kind of location Han would choose. Not a warehouse near the docks, too obvious, too easily surrounded. Somewhere with multiple exits. Somewhere Han had used before and trusted. She remembered, from fragments of things Jin Hwan had told her 7 years earlier on the harbor at night, a decommissioned freight facility outside the city that Han had once described as a place. No one thinks to look, because no one thinks it still exists. They found it by 2 in the morning, and by 2:15, Jin Hwan understood that going in with force would very likely get his sons killed before he ever reached them, because Han was many things but never careless, and a man that calculating did not take 5 children hostage without ensuring their deaths would cost their captors nothing in return. So he went in alone. He left every weapon he owned in the car, walked through the front gate of the facility with his hands visible, and told the men guarding it, in a voice that carried the specific authority of a man who had commanded them or men like them for a decade, that he had come to negotiate his own surrender in exchange for his son's safety. It took 11 minutes of standing perfectly still, while 3 separate men decided whether shooting him or bringing him inside would serve them better. And Jin Hwan spent every one of those 11 minutes doing the only unconscious thing his body could offer him for comfort: straightening his collar, exactly the way his father had taught him, exactly the way 5 small boys 300 meters away were very likely doing too, without knowing why, the way they always did when they were frightened. Han met him inside a stripped-down loading bay, standing beside the 5 boys, who were zip-tied to a support beam but otherwise unharmed. Zuri's face streaked with dried tears, and Kido positioned protectively in front of his younger brothers despite being tied himself. "You didn't need to come alone," Han said, almost fondly, as if this were still a lesson he was teaching rather than the final act of a war. "I didn't come to fight you," Jin Hwan said. "I came to end this the only way that keeps them alive. Take the Empire, take everything. I'll sign whatever you want signed. Just let them go." For a moment, watching Han's expression, Jin Hwan believed it might actually work, that the man who had raised him truly only wanted the throne, and not the blood that came with defending it. Then Han's gaze moved past him, toward the door, and Jin Hwan understood a half-second before the first shot rang out that Han had never intended to let any of them leave that building alive, empire or no empire, because 5 living witnesses to 20 years of buried betrayal were a liability no signed document could erase. What happened in the next 4 minutes would be described later by the 3 men who survived to be arrested in wildly different ways, but all of them agreed on one detail: that Jin Hwan moved like a man who had stopped calculating the cost of anything the moment he saw his sons tied to that beam. He was wounded twice, once along the ribs and once, more seriously, through the shoulder, in the process of getting between his sons and gunfire, cutting the zip ties one-handed while shielding Zuri's small body with his own. By the time the rival families Jin Hwan had spent the night calling in favors from arrived. Alerted by Daniela, the moment Jin Hwan walked into the facility alone, Han was already on the ground, disarmed by his own remaining loyalist in a desperate last bid for leniency, and Jin Hwan was sitting against the support beam with all 5 boys pressed against him, bleeding, and for the first time in over a decade, unmistakably, openly relieved. Daniela reached him minutes later, having refused every order to wait outside, and the sound she made seeing him alive, surrounded by 5 sons clinging to him, was not one Jin Hwan had ever heard from her before, not even 7 years earlier on the harbor, when neither of them had known yet how much they'd eventually lose. "I convinced myself for 6 years that you would have done exactly this," she said later, at the hospital, sitting beside a bed he refused to lie fully down in until every son had been checked over twice. "And I still told myself I was being foolish for believing it. I'm sorry. I should have trusted that the man I loved wouldn't have let this happen if he'd known." "You had no way of knowing I didn't know," Jin Hwan said. "You protected them the only way you could. I'm the one who spent 6 years grieving you instead of looking harder." "We were both deceived by the same man," she said, "for the same reason. He needed us both weak to keep you obedient." Han's arrest, and the unraveling of the network he'd built to cover his tracks over 2 decades, took the better part of a month, during which Jin Hwan did something none of the old council members expected, and few of them survived professionally. He began systematically dismantling the parts of the syndicate that had nothing to do with legitimate shipping, severing ties with the security contractors, the arms brokers. The quiet arrangements with corrupt port officials that had made the CO name feared rather than simply respected. Some of the old guard resisted. Most, watching a man who had just personally walked into an ambush unarmed to save 5 children, found they no longer had the stomach to test him. By the time the last of Han's loyalists had either been arrested or quietly retired themselves out of the city, the Seo family that emerged bore almost no resemblance to the empire Jin Hwan's grandfather had built from Buson's docks. It was smaller. It was legitimate, or close enough to legitimate that Jin Hwan could finally sleep without calculating how many of his own decisions might one day be used against his sons the way his father's had been used against him. The wedding, when it finally happened, took place on the same stretch of harbor where he and Daniela had first learned to trust each other 7 years earlier, with no guest list beyond the boys. Daniela's mother and sister flown in from Kisumu for the first time in their lives, and a handful of people Jin Hwan had decided, after everything, actually deserved to be there. There was no priest from a cathedral, no 300 watching strangers, no alliance to secure. Zuri, 5 years old and utterly unbothered by ceremony, interrupted the vows to ask if he could hold the rings, and Jin Hwan let him, because he had learned, in the space of a few short months, that the moments worth protecting were rarely the ones anyone had planned. Kido, still the most cautious of the 5, waited until the reception to walk up to Jin Hwan alone, without his brothers, and ask the question Jin Hwan had been quietly hopping for since the first week. "Can I call you Dad now, or is it still too soon?" "It was never too soon," Jin Hwan said, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsteady since he was 16 years old, watching his father's casket lowered into ground his family had bled for. "It just took me a while to earn it." By the following spring, the Seo name had quietly stopped appearing in the reports that used to keep 3 intelligence agencies mildly interested in the family's shipping manifests. Jin Hwan ran the legitimate business by day and spent every evening on the floor of a house that no longer needed the kind of security he'd grown up behind, listening to 5 very different, very loud boys argue about whose turn it was to sit next to their mother at dinner. Daniela never fully stopped watching doorways the way 6 years of hiding had trained her to, but she'd started slowly, to let herself stop mid-sentence, sometimes to laugh at something one of the boys said. An unguarded sound Jin Hwan had first fallen for on a dock in Mombasa, and had spent 6 years believing he'd never hear again. He had inherited an empire built on fear and dismantled it with his own hands to keep 5 boys safe. And if you asked him, standing on that same stretch of harbor years later with a son on each side of him and Daniela's hand in his, whether it had been worth losing everything his family had built to gain it, he would tell you, without hesitation, that he had never once actually lost anything worth keeping.